Okay.
Okay, y'all roll.
We may be a little small today because of that trip to Israel that they're talking about. So, anyway, we're going to be in Mark chapter 5, and we're going to look at some of the richly and pure people that Jesus comes across. Feel free to comment on that. Again, this comes from our class in Leviticus back in March, where we talked about clean and unclean and unintentional, intentional sins. And unintentional sins, Israel, the people could go and cleanse and offer the appropriate sacrifice and so forth. But the intentional sin was only God's realm to forgive. Usually that was a pretty serious sin. Well, actually, it always was a pretty serious sin because it was a rebellious type of sin. The idea of fulfillment is correctly interpreting. I'm just kind of highlighting some past things. The law in Moses' day was, the idea of Torah was instruction, but by the time we get to Jesus' day, the law was viewed more legalistically in many circles. And then there are a variety of positions that we find even in the Gospels and Acts. There are Pharisees there are at least 7 different groups of Pharisees. I mentioned the bleeding ones last week. Sadducees, Essenes, John the Baptizer, the freemen of the Gentile world, Judaizers, God-fearing Gentiles, proselytes, Samaritans, and of course Jesus. So there are a lot of activity. It wasn't a monolithic group of people, and they all had different views, and it's either this week or next week. I think it's on the Sabbath. We'll look at some of how they viewed, one viewed one way and one viewed it a different way. So they had their disagreements even among themselves as to what work was on the Sabbath and what you could or could not do on the Sabbath. So these are some of the things that we find, again, in a society that oftentimes we just kind of lump all together when in reality it's a pretty diverse group of people. Now let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your blessings and your love for us through your Son. Thank you for watching over us. May we glorify and honor you as we serve you in our various ways. We're thankful for BAML, and we're thankful for the time we can spend together. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, there are 3 situations in Mark chapter 5. The first is, and they're all familiar, so there's nothing earth-shattering in any of this. There's the demon-possessed man that Jesus comes contact with. He crosses the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. You notice who got out of the boat and who didn't. Jesus got out of the boat, and the disciples, fine, go. We'll stay here. You take care of that fellow, that's running down, screaming and yelling and all that. So, but we find out this man lived in the tombs, unclean place. No one could bind him, not even with a chain, for he'd often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart, broke the irons on his feet. No one's strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. So he was, we would say, mentally ill, but we'll find out that that's not the case. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran, fell at his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." So he has an impure spirit. He's in the tombs, and so there are all these things going on. And then in a minute, we'll find out he's with unclean animals. Jesus asks, "What is his name?" "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. it's kind of interesting. I mean, you read these things and you wonder, what were they, what were these evil spirits thinking? Why not? Well, I go all over the place, but they didn't want to leave this particular area. Was there a reason for that? Unanswered questions. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." And he gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned, which gives a whole new idea to devil's ham. So anyway, that's what happened to them. So here's a fellow who is demon possessed or possessed by impure spirits. There's not a lot in the Old Testament concerning impure spirits, the devil, things like that. Obviously, Genesis 3 is the first time we're introduced to the accuser or the devil, Job, in chapters 1 and 2. And again, the word there could be accuser. Most translated Satan or the devil. There's an evil spirit in the mouths of the prophets during the day of Ahab. Probably one or two more, but they're not really focused on that. Most of the time it's basically just God dealing with people. Why now? A question could be asked. Why is it so, in Jesus' day, so popular to have impure spirits? And I think it's just, again, the conflict we have between evil and good, between Satan and God. And so I think that's why there's more of that.
Is it safe to assume that at least on some occasions?
What was that?
Is it safe to assume that at least on some occasions the use of that expression might simply be a misunderstanding of what we would today call psychiatric medicines?
It's tempting to do that in our Western Enlightenment ideas, and that we don't believe in the devil.
Well, here I know specifically, as you pointed out, that there are demons in there communicating with Jesus. Right. So that's not the case.
Yeah.
But in some of these cases, they don't elaborate as much as
right.
Here.
Yeah.
They simply say unclean spirit came out.
Now, all I can say is that I know in the Western culture, we tend to just push that aside and say it's some type of psychiatric thing. In other cultures where they don't have that influence, then there's more of the nature influence. People do fear river gods and demons, and a lot of people say they've been impacted by that. So I'm going to let God handle some of that. And so if somebody wants to believe that there's an evil spirit in the river, or an evil spirit in the jungle or forest or wherever, or whatever other, even in the village, that's fine. That's the culture they have to deal with. And,
they have people that actually did and still do believe, because right. They had exorcism. They felt like their kids right. was possessed. We are taught that either two spirits going to live within us. Even one is the spirit of God, or one is the spirit of evil. And if we allow ourselves to yield to temptation, we open the door for the evil spirits to possess us.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. Right outside the Edinburgh Castle, there's a little plaque about where witches were tried. I'll have to read the plaque. But I took a picture of it. So anyway, I think it were tried and found guilty and all. But that was some of the idea they were possessed. And so that type of belief, people were witches because they could stir up storms. And I read an article about that this week as well. Why all these hurricanes or volcanoes or whatever, is because back in the 1600s. So witches were blamed for these different weather events that happened because they were opposed or whatever. So at least that's what people thought.
But also when you get back, and now I'm just talking literature here, but when you get back in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey and Odysseus' encounter with the Cyclops and all these things, and the Scylla and Charybdis, these giant seven-headed monsters from the cliffs, and the giant toilet bowl flushing them in the sea, you know, we know those things are actually true. They happen, you know, we know what an elephant skull looks like. It has two eye sockets like that. But they had never seen a mammoth. Well, a mammoth doesn't have two eye sockets and has one big hole here, and both eyes come out here. Well, when they saw these skulls there, they were convinced this was a giant one-eyed man, and so they made up an entire belief about it. But also, I've seen the seven-headed monster that comes down into the ocean and pulls men off of ships.
Yeah.
St. Petersburg, Florida, Tampa Bay. I was working my way through college. We looked out there, and there were 7 water spouts, and there was a ship going by. And I have no doubt that Odysseus explored them. And Homer wrote a story about something he had seen. These giant things that come down and suck men out of boats. You know, they make genuine gods or goddesses or demons or what have you, based upon natural circumstances.
It gets confusing because, again, we look at it more like from a psychiatric point of view. Other people see it. And so somewhere along the way, the truth is probably in the middle. There's some demons, and we need to be alert to that. And there's some things that are just in our minds. Some people, you know, just people, fiction writers, Tolkien and others, you know, come up with all these great stories and all the things that are involved in that, but you won't see some of the trees walking in the forest and talking and things like that. So anyway, it's just something. But these people, this guy had all these evil spirits, and they go into the pigs, and the pigs go down. So there's unclean things throughout the story. And if he's in the tombs, where's Jesus? Well, he's probably in the tombs, talking to him in the graveyard. And this is probably why graveyards get the reputation they do. At night, we don't walk through graveyards. Why not? Because you never know what's going to come out of the grave. So we have our own imagination that goes with that.
Were Jews ceremonially unclean if they walked through a graveyard?
Well, that's what we're talking about here. Was that made one unclean? But was that sinful?
And it would require a cleansing at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. And the whitewashed tombs what they did was they painted the tombs so people would know where the tombs, the gravestone, where the grave was, whatever. So they wouldn't accidentally walk on a grave. Of course, if you did it unknowingly, an unintentional sin was just you cleanse, and there were requirements in Leviticus. You can go back and read some of that. That if you touch the dead body, you know, this is what you needed to do, and there were people died. You know, they died in houses. Somebody had to touch them. So there was it's unintentional. It wasn't anybody, you know, just going in and murdering somebody. It's just unintentional. But people died. You go out and bury them. But you're unclean. Well, it's not sinful. And when we talk about the next couple of characters again, we see the same thing. We find a man now in his right mind after the pigs are in the drowned. Those tending the pigs ran to the town and the countryside, and people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man that had been possessed by the legion of demons, and a legion, 5,000, so pretty active group of demons. And you have to wonder again. Anyway, all kinds of things come to mind. They were afraid. Verse 16, those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave the region. Not quite sure why. You would think that, hey, if he did that, it would be a positive thing. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man with the demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus said, no, you stay here and tell your people about what had happened, how much the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you. And that's what he did. He went to the Decapolis, or 10 cities, and told how much Jesus had done. So there are things that happen in these stories. We will not see the events of the Decapolis, but here's a guy going out. Well, he's sowing seed in preparation for the resurrection. And so this opens the door for later the apostles to go in this area and proclaim Jesus resurrected from the dead. It just goes back, you think about the captivity. Why was Israel in, what good can come out of a Babylonian captivity? Well, when God sent Israel into captivity, one of the things he said is that many would just settle and live there. They would be permanent dysphoria type of people. They would live out in these captive areas, or they were to build houses and start businesses and influence people in that area. But that's a preparation for the gospel as well, because then you find synagogues, and we start seeing how Paul went to the synagogues. We see in the eastern part as well, Jewish influences all the way up to China by 500 BC. So there were certainly things happening behind the scenes, or at least in history, that we're not as familiar with, but this is God preparing things. So here's a demon-possessed man. I want to go with you. You would think, well, yeah, come on, but rather go tell people what happened, and that gives them an opportunity to, well, they can, they knew what he was, and they see how he is. They're going to listen to him. It's an opportunity to listen. And then when somebody comes through from Jerusalem, oh, yeah, I remember hearing about Jesus.
There's one problem though.
Okay.
Why the people wanted Jesus to leave.
Yeah, that's...
Somebody owned those pigs. That was their livelihood. Even though they were Jews, they were rearing pigs or raising pigs.
Yeah, there's a...
And now there's 2,000 of them gone. And Jesus was the one that put the evil spirits in them and drowned them. So that would cause many people that own the pigs to say, get out of here.
And if they were Jews, then that would be obviously a problem with the law.
Yep.
And so Jesus, is he making a correction here? These are unclean animals. He didn't say to the, well, no, I'm not going to, now, okay, let me say it this way. Jesus could have said, I'm not going to destroy these pigs because they're God's creatures. He just put the demons in the unclean animals. Does that mean that Jesus wanted to destroy all that? No. So let's not go to the extreme on that one. But the pigs were used as, again, an illustration of the uncleanness or uncleanliness of the situation in which these people found themselves. And the law had been violated. And you go back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. You see, the parable of the two sons, the lost sons. The youngest one, what's he doing? He's feeding pigs. Wait a minute, why am I doing this? This is unclean. I shouldn't be doing this. And so there's this conflict. And just as a side note, some people think that the Herod in Acts ate one too many pigs. And that's why when he was struck by the angel, it was whatever that disease comes from pigs that's not cooked well.
Why was there a difference between Jesus telling this man, go tell everyone what happened to you, whereas other times he would say, no, don't tell anybody?
I think he's away from where the impact of what Jesus was doing. Again, I think part of it's preparation, as I said. I think the ones within Israel, there was a time, I think Jesus has a time frame, or he's working within a time frame, and some people would obviously want to push that time frame. Let's make him king, because they had this messianic idea that David was coming back and he would become king. Here's the king, he's got miracles, he feeds people, let's make him king. And that's John 5, where he feeds the 5,000. They want to go and make him king. Well, Jesus didn't want that at that moment. That was down the road.
I think too, that because they had separated themselves from this man as an outcast, Jesus told him, go show yourself to the people, tell them.
Yeah.
He was no longer that person that was cutting himself, wasn't at himself.
Right.
You know, people want to know what change came about you to make you back to normal. Well, share with the people. And I think that's the reason he did
Yeah.
it.
So
To
there's
pull it back into the society.
right. Yeah, well, that's true. And obviously, that would be a sort of a counteract to what Joe was saying about the loss of money. Yeah, but I was demon possessed. Yeah, I had all these. You remember what I was like, you know? Now look at me now. And is money more important than my being put back together?
It was to the owners of the pigs.
But, maybe a lot of people get tired of, some of that too. You understand what I'm saying, is that, money is so important, that's the only thing, and then, obviously, there are things much more important than money.
But you would think these Jews that were owners of these pigs were violating the law to begin with. And so it didn't really make a whole lot of difference. In fact, they were raising pigs.
Yeah.
It's just that they got their.
But the question is, how do you know they were Jews?
I'm sorry?
How do you know they were Jews? Were there not any non-Jews living in Israel at the time?
Probably not. Not where Jesus was then.
There were Romans there. It was
Yeah,
occupied.
yeah, there were Romans. But
They-
I think these were Jews. I think if we read a little further, it tells us they were Jews.
Curious to know why they would be raising swine.
Yeah.
But when you look at well, we'll see it. And again, I did 2 classes yesterday, so this is running together, but somewhere, when they, and this may be on the Sabbath, you have the religious leaders say, or Jesus saying one thing about killing me, and then the religious leaders want to go out and kill him. Why did they want to kill him when he pointed out things to him? So it's not like it's not an issue there. There were contradictions all over the place. Again, it's not a everybody sees things the same way type of society. Everybody was just all these diverse views going on, and so you have religious leaders who want to kill Jesus, but that's a violation of the law. And not kill, murder, basically. And they're plotting to murder him. And then you have, so Jews doing pigs is not a problem.
They
Again.
didn't care about them, they didn't eat them. So.
Well, yeah, they're just raising them. They didn't have to eat them.
But why raise them if nobody can eat them?
Well, there's probably people in the, again.
Somebody was buying
There are people there who were not Jews.
Or did some Jews eat pigs?
But remember, Jesus told Peter, everything I created is good.
Yeah. But again, that was later, but still, obviously. Now, if you don't want to eat pig, bacon, that's fine. But most of us like bacon. That's the way. Anyway. So we have this, he's in his right mind, people are frightened, but Jesus healed the man. Now, the next one is he raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. There are 2 stories within there. He crosses back over the lake to the other side. Large crowd gathered around him by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. Now let me do a little side note. If you've heard of the series The Chosen, and you can find us, I think this is in season 3. This is really well portrayed. these two stories in The Chosen, and it's worth watching. That being said, I can't tell you which episode it was. You'll have to watch all season 3. Either that or maybe you can figure it out. A large crowd followed him and pressed around him. So again, if they're walking through a village, here in America, our streets are fairly wide. We have front yards, things are open. If you saw pictures of in Europe, whether in Germany, Austria, or even England, Scotland, streets are not wide, and you can skip across the road about 2 steps, type of thing. They're just narrow streets, narrow sidewalks, so it's not like here. When we think about the village in the Middle East, again, you're looking at narrow streets. When I went to Jerusalem, I was amazed in the old city of how narrow the streets were. And it was like a pickup truck pointing down the street, and if a person stood here and a person stood there, that was the width of the street. Just not very wide. So you can see, or it gives you a whole different perspective on how these things look. So here's Jesus going through this little village, and crowds are all gathered around. It's not like going down my street at my house and have all the neighbors there. We wouldn't make it hardly a dent in the width of the street, but here these people are crushing in. And the story continues, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touched his clothes, I would be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt her body that it was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around into the crowd, or in the crowd, and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples, in their very practical way, said, "Don't you see how many people are around?" It's one of those. I think I would have done that. Does this crowd mean anything? What do you mean, who touched you? Everybody touched you walking through here. How can you even ask that question? It's funny in a way. It's serious in a way. It's how you look at it. My sarcasm gets me in trouble, and so I look at this as kind of humorous when the disciples ask that question, like, "Really? Who touched you?" Type of thing. It's interesting. So let's see. I've got to keep up where I am here. Okay, I missed a point here. Let me go back. Jairus fell at Jesus' feet. It's interesting. Jairus falls at Jesus' feet. The demon-possessed man falls at Jesus' feet. So that's something I didn't bring up, but that needs. And then come and heal. The crowd of people. She's unclean because of her bleeding, and spent a lot of money on doctors. I know that doesn't happen today. Was she an outcast in society? This is where some of the things get kind of interesting. You can read Numbers 5, 1, 4, and sometimes this is debated among scholars, again, Jewish scholars in particular, as to the activities or where this was she subject to being an outcast in such a way that she was not even allowed in town. Well, she couldn't enter the temple. She was unclean. So that had to be, that was prohibited from her. Probably going through Jerusalem was not the best thing either, because of the crowds, and if you touch somebody again, everybody becomes unclean. Out in the countryside, it may have been a little different, where she could have made her way around things, and people may have known her. It may not have, again, in The Chosen, and maybe this is an argument of the scene, but It appeared people didn't know her until they saw the blood and said, unclean, unclean. If people knew her, they maybe stepped aside but understood her suffering. So there's a lot of things going, a lot of questions that can be raised by the text. Our day-to-day activities that are not restricted, but holy days and temple sacrifices were. So there's some things involved in that. Again, even Leviticus points out some of these difficulties that they had to wrestle with. The normal activity of life, when you became unclean. It's not like people didn't touch dead bodies. It's not like married couples didn't have relations. These things happen, and they become unclean. It was a daily part of life. So your response, it wasn't that you sinned, it was the response that you had to the uncleanliness. If you did the appropriate cleansing aspects of it, then you were allowed back into the tabernacle, in the case of Leviticus, temple in the case of Jesus.
She could have shared it with a friend, and the friend could have spread it. But she didn't actually touch Jesus. She believed in her heart if she could just touch his garment.
Yeah.
And she touched the hem
Right.
of his garment. But he felt it with
Yeah.
his powers to say,
Right.
someone touched me. Because
Yeah.
the power from him left him into whoever touched him. So he
Right.
wanted to know who touched me.
Yeah, and when she reached out to touch it, now in the chosen, she ends up on the ground and reaches out and touches the tassel, which would be at the bottom of the cloak.
Mhm.
And that's when the power goes out. Which is interesting in some ways, because when we look at how we see Jesus, as a Jew, he was a typical Jewish person. He had tassels. It'd be interesting to know what scriptures he would have put in those tassels. Because you write your scripture down, you put it in your tassel. That's something that was important. So it'd be kind of interesting. Jesus, what was really important to you? Love your neighbor as yourself. There's God is one. The Shema. There are so many others that we could put up. So it's one of those. Again, my weirdness gets me to ask these questions that cannot be answered. But anyway, so it'd be kind of an interesting point as to what he was asking, or what he would be wearing or having as tassels. But you're right. The minute she touched even a piece of his clothing, the power came out. And you notice the power goes one way. In both these, actually all three stories, the power is just going one way. It's going from Jesus to. It's not coming the other way. So the cleanliness is going out to clean these people, to pronounce them clean. Now, maybe the argument that the demon-possessed man wasn't a Jew is that he was not involved in any temple aspects or sacrificial aspects. But here was a woman, and even though none of this is said in the text, this opens up for her the opportunity to first be cleansed, and second, to go to the temple or for the appropriate sacrifices, and be part again of the community. Depending again, there's some questions raised. Was she part of the community? Everybody knew who she was, or was she a stranger to this group of people and they didn't know who she was? There's some, again, it's how you want to read the text.
Well, I don't know why, but I've always pictured her as a middle-aged woman. Probably not, but I don't know. But if that be the case, and she's only had this hemorrhaging malady for 12 years, you assume she had a normal life at one time and didn't know people,
Right.
and was a part of the community.
Yeah, or was she young enough still to have children? There's another issue. If this was something that happened at a younger age, and she couldn't get married, didn't have children, she was in a situation that was really bad for that community, that period of time, because having children meant that there would be someone to take care of you. So, I don't know if my kids want to think that way. They take care of us, but sometimes I wonder if they just want to leave us in Scotland. No. Concerning the tassels, Numbers 15:37, The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corner of your garments with a blue cord on each tassel. You will have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, that you may obey them and not prostitute yourselves by chasing after the lust of your own hearts and eyes. Then you will remember to obey all my commands and will consecrate to your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. And so that was the purpose of the tassels, to remind them who they were in relation to God. So here was this, again, touching the tassel. Power again moves from Jesus to the woman. The woman is cleansed. The story, we do have a little more. Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Verse 32, verse 33. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet. So here's another person who falls at his feet. And trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And so she is freed. Everybody can see, and she can go away rejoicing. Again, in the chosen, she ends up going to the lake and running in and just washing and everything. So there's kind of sort of the idea there. Would she later go to the temple? Probably back into the things that were part of her, of the culture of the day as far as the Jews were concerned, the things that were important to them. Again, the cleanliness, the opportunity to come before God in the temple. Now, while he was still speaking in verse 35, while Jesus was still speaking, let's see where we are, people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead. Why bother to teach her anymore? That was probably a pretty big shock to have someone run up and say, your daughter is dead. Again, he's a synagogue leader, so he's an important figure. People knew who he was. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. That's pretty powerful. That's an interesting statement. Don't be afraid, just believe. And yet, but she's dead. And so, how do you balance that out? Don't be afraid, just believe. She's dead. So it's a tough call there. Verse 37, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, the three inner disciples. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? Now, they had professional wailers. And this was a means, mourning was a means to release what's the word that we could use there? Somebody can throw it out. Just the grief and a way of letting your emotions go. We tend to be a little more stoic. We'll sit there, in our funeral homes, but death is a tough thing, and you see it on TV and movies that move you, or even in your own personal lives, we see it. And when my mother died, I didn't have any problem. Maybe a few tears at the graveyard, but when we had a memorial service, it just broke down. So those are things that happen, and that's just part of the grief process. Well, this was an encouragement to have this grieving process, and you see that in John 11 with Lazarus. There are a group of people there because it's a grieving process, and this was the way they helped do that. Again, it's a different type of culture that encourages that type of thing, that mourning. If you're into TV programs, Klingons, and Star Trek, if you were, when someone died and the Klingon would scream out, yell out, and so that was their for whatever you think of Star Trek, that was their way of expressing grief. And so there are different cultures do it differently.
Do you think in verse 40, it says, and they laughed at him? The previous verse, they were weeping and wailing. Perhaps a better translation would have been they scoffed at him?
Probably. I have to look at different translations to see. I didn't notice that.
I mean, I would find it difficult to transition from weeping to ha ha. No,
Yeah.
Not that, it was like, what?
Well, if you're not emotionally involved, that might not be as hard
Well,
to
I
do.
guess the professional whalers might have stopped him there.
Yeah.
And it's also too because of what he said to them.
Yeah.
She's just asleep. And
Right.
they kept saying, no, she's dead. He said, she's sleeping.
Yeah.
And that's what caused them to laugh.
And that's an interesting, when you look at this dead and asleep thing. In Lazarus' case, Jesus said, well, he's asleep, and the apostle said, well, he's gonna wake up. And then finally Jesus said, he's dead. And he's been dead for 4 days or whatever. And so, okay, it's kind of, I don't know why they use different words or why they were, death was pretty, I mean, it happens, but it happened pretty.
It's final.
Yeah, well, that's true, it's final, but it's pretty open in that society. Today we use words like, well, he passed, or he, and I'm sure there's several others, I can't remember, but I usually just say, he died. Let's just be honest, he died. We might not like it, but people want to kind of let's tone down this aspect. He passed, it's so well, yeah, we got to kind of know he died and died. It's so final, but that's sort of what it is, except for the Christian point of view, obviously. So.
I never in my life heard the expression, he passed or she passed, until I was, believe it or not, in my 50s.
Yeah.
And the first time I heard someone say, she passed, like an idiot, I actually asked, where was she going? And I had not a clue what the person was saying. And I felt like an idiot afterwards, but now I'm familiar with the expression. But I was in my 50s the first time I heard that expression. I had no idea what it meant. And the rest of you say you've heard it all your life.
No.
I didn't.
Yeah.
It's relatively new.
Huh?
It's relatively new.
Yeah, I think so.
Very much.
We were on a bus, and I had my walking cane, and so I had gotten on, and the bus took off, and I went flying forwards, grabbed hold of things. So I came back, and I was talking to this Scotsman. We were just talking about different things as we were going along, and I was standing there. I said, I'll be okay. And he said, well, I'll reach out and grab you if I have to, And he was young, so I appreciated that. So, what do you do? He said, I'm a joiner. Okay. In the mind, what do you join? So I had, I've never heard the term. You'll have to. He said, I'm a carpenter. But they use the word joiner. It was kind of, I hadn't heard that, or if I had, I never. Anyway, but it was an interesting conversation. Just gives you the idea, a lift is an elevator and just different things that you have to kind of translate as you go along. So,
Just understand.
I don't know what this has to do with anything, but anyway, so the child's not dead, but asleep, and they laughed at him or scoffed at him, which may be a better way to look at it. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went to where she was. He took her by the hand and said to her, that word, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, okay, not to let anyone know, that's kind of,
I don't know what Mark was thinking when he wrote that, but, you know, it's kind of hard when the girl comes walking out the door. You were dead. You know, it's like the guy, the two guys that were digging a grave and saw some raiders coming. Their friend had died, and so they throw the body in on the tomb of Elijah, and they take off running, and the guy, he's dead. He stands up, he's alive because of the bones of Elijah. And I can always picture he getting up and he sees the raiders and he sees his friends and he starts running after them and catches up with them, you know, and wait a minute, you were dead. You know, so, anyway, there's things that happen in these and you have to wonder about this. But Jesus, the corpse is impure. So we had the demon-possessed man, that's impure, with the pigs and the tombs. You had the bleeding woman, that was impure, and now a corpse is ritually impure. Numbers 19, 11 through 19 deals with that. Jesus entered the house, also contacting ritual impurity, again, Numbers 19. And I mentioned the whitewashed tombs earlier. Death has removed the girl from the source of her impurity. You can think about that. He touches her, power moves again from Jesus to the dead, and she is raised. And we see that in Matthew 27, in a very obscure, only mentioned in Matthew 27, 51 through 53, when Jesus was died, the tombs broke open, and power came to that. Anyway, there may be a connection here. Also, Luke 7, a young man is raised. He stops he was dead longer. Stops it, touches him, and he's raised from the dead. So we had those things. Now, what's interesting, there's 12 is mentioned twice in this text. The woman had been 12 years with the bleeding, which is crazy. But the girl was 12 years old. And Mark does this a number of times. I think there's about a dozen times that he throws in something totally obscure. Nobody else does it. The woman in the other accounts, 12 years is mentioned. But this girl, we're not told she's 12 years old except in Mark. Over in chapter 6, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, in verse 39, he has them sit in groups on the green grass. Mark is the only one that says green grass, which kind of gives you an idea of what time of year it was. And maybe there was a festival either people were going to in Jerusalem or coming from. That's something to think about. And then in Mark 6 again, in the story of Jesus walking on the water, let's see, verse 48, shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. Okay, Mark writes this, one of these disciples reads, or, Peter, John read, or Jesus says, well, I was going to go past you. Wait a minute, we're fighting this storm and you're going to walk by us and leave us out here? And now, again, some scholar was looking at this, that bothered me for years, and he finally looked at Job 9, verse 11, where it says God goes by in silence or something like that. And there's several other references to God passing by. But anyway, Mark throws in these little tidbits. And it makes for interesting talk about what's going on. So she was 12 years old. The only thing I could think of, and I may be way off on this, is that in some way this is a restoration to the community, a connection with Israel, but however, whatever it is. So Jesus entered, he touched and he approached all these unclean people. He did not reject any cleansing rituals. He didn't tell them don't do anything. Nothing is said about it basically, but these were part of he helped where they could now be part of the community and involved in the cleansing and the temple worship and sacrifice. And he saw people as important, and that's what we need to see as well. All these people were important. Maybe the demon-possessed man and the tombs, I wouldn't want to live in a graveyard, but Jesus saw this guy as important, and he healed him. The woman possessed, was she going to live the rest of her life bleeding? And so she bled to death. She was important to Jesus. She had faith to reach out and touch him, but still, Jesus went even further and said, your faith has made you well. And then the little girl, obviously dead, very, just recently dead, died somewhere in the midst of the story, and he gives it back to her parents, and certainly a lot of meaning to that. One of the things, again, that would be interesting is to know what happened to these characters. What did their lives turn out to be? So the Bible doesn't go into that. So anybody want to make any comments or questions? We had some really good ones.
With the woman who touched, it was her belief, her faith.
Right.
That was really the center of this whole situation with her touching the hem of his garment. With the guy in the graveyard, because everybody had alienated him, because he was so possessed by lesions, those lesions must have calmed themselves long enough for him, himself, to recognize and cried out to Jesus for help. Because
I'm not sure it was him with that. I would see it that way. I think that it was the devil, the legions themselves crying out to, because that happens in other texts where the demon says, "What do you want to have? What do you want with me, Jesus' son?" It's who do you? If you wanted someone to give you a reference, you're not going to pick somebody who's against you, right? So
but did Jesus say, spoke to the man, and then the legion spoke out differently? And said, "What do you have to do with me?"
I think he had, let's see, the demons begged Jesus, send us, well, let's go back a little. He shouted at, when he saw Jesus, so it was the man, he came running, telling his needs in front of him. He shouted at the top of his, "What do you want to do?" Now, was he under the impact of the demons then?
You know how sometimes people could be possessed, but
Yeah.
they can act normal for
Right.
a few minutes,
Yeah, so-
and then they go back into that state?
That could be. It's one of those crazy things. Poor choice of word. Here is Jesus, or here is who's recognizing Jesus? Is it the man himself, or is it the demons with the man? Did the demons tell him, "You don't want anything to do with this man"?
But long
They're
as
no,
you
they're
read
lies,
what
so-
King James says.
I'm sorry?
I say I'm only speaking from what I read in
Yeah.
King James.
So, it's just, there's just different ways to ask questions about that. So, was the man speaking for himself, or was it the man, who told about Jesus? That's another story. That's another
He
question.
could have heard it. He could have heard it.
Well, if he's all alone in the tombs, maybe. But and again, I won't argue that point. He could have heard it. There's just so many variables in there that make, you can ask all these different questions and then come up with all these different ways of looking at it to kind of draw a picture or see a picture there, which isn't surprising because we see that in Scripture all the time. We have all these different stories. Again, Mark has green grass. Well, nobody else does. Well, that gives you a little bit different perspective on what's happening there. Or Jesus is passing by. The other accounts just have, he gets in the boat, stops the storm. There's a little bit different perspective there. So there's all kinds of questions we can ask. And so I think the individual man, where did he hear about Jesus? Was it the demons who recognized? At least the way I see it, all the demon accounts, they all knew who Jesus was. And James, demons trembling God, so they all knew who, so there's that. But there's a lot of ways, I think, we can look at it different ways, so. Did the people tell him, did he hear it before he was demon possessed? What was going on there?
Were there others who tried to cast?
Others who tried, yeah, they had their own, exorcists, forgot about that. So
They had tried it, it had been on the chain at one time.
Yeah.
People had tried it.
Yeah, so there's other ways, yeah, there's all kinds of things that come out in the story that we can raise and have interesting little questions. So, it appears that he obviously recognized Jesus, in some way, but told without him, the story. Was it an individual, was it somebody helping him, was it the demons? I think you got all kinds of ways to look at that. It makes it for fun, it makes fun out of all this, it raises all kinds of.
We also have the idea that the English language is so difficult to grasp because it's not a language, it's four languages. We've got the old Anglo-Saxon, we've got the language of Vikings, we've got the language of the French for 2.5 centuries. French was the official language of the British Isles. And they have Latin from the Catholic Church for 1,500 years. They kept up, English is a conglomeration of 4 different languages. It's not one. And whereas there's such a simple translation into other languages, it can drive you crazy trying to find a way to translate it into English. I mean, let's face it, the word baptism did not even exist in the English language until the King James Version came out and said, well, we're not going to offend the king and tell him what baptizo says, which means to plunge, because he wasn't plunged. So we're just going to transliterate the word and bring this Greek word baptizo and make it baptism, and let the king interpret it any way he wants. I mean, there's so many fallacies in the King James Version of the Bible, but it's what for 3.5 centuries, that's all people ever had. If you spoke English, you had King James Version of the Bible.
You had the King's English, which is what we ran into in Scotland. We had to walk around translating what, obviously, I didn't see underground that much, but you had to translate lift and.
Subway doesn't mean what it means here.
So different things, and that makes for all that. Next week, we'll look at the Sabbath, some of the controversies around the Sabbath, and then the following week, I think we're going to spend a little time with Paul.